Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm the curator and editor for The Dissenter and the host of The Dissenter Weekly. Welcome to this edition. It's the edition for March 31st, 2025. If you're listening to this on Monday, I thank you for being a supporter and a subscriber of the show and for supporting the Dissenter newsletter. This is one way that the journalism that I regularly produce is possible. Uh, Thank you for your support, your regular contributions. And if you are not a supporter of the show, please go to thedissenter.org. Please consider becoming a subscriber. You can also donate if you're not willing to commit to regularly supporting on a monthly basis. You can go and just chip in a few dollars so I can do this work to cover whistleblowers, secrecy, and press freedom issues that are of great importance. As we can see, there's no shortage of stories from the past week to cover and discuss. So I have a set of headlines at the top of the show for this edition, and then I've got a main story on the fact that students at universities are now being abducted by ICE agents for co-authoring or writing articles in student newspapers as a hugely alarming development, far from the kind of celebration or promotion of free speech that was promised by the Trump administration. Of course, I could and so many others could see through that. But let's get to the headlines for this week. The first headline is about the U.S. Supreme Court refusing to hear a casino tycoon's lawsuit to overturn a major press freedom precedent. The U.S. Supreme Court declined a request by Las Vegas casino tycoon Steve Wynn, longtime Republican, a billionaire. This was to overturn a landmark case known as New York Times v. Sullivan that established protections for the press from libel lawsuits. Sullivan established what is known as the actual malice standard, ensuring that media organizations could engage in criticism of government and public officials and also fulfill their watchdog role. The lawsuit was filed against the Associated Press, this lawsuit by Wynn, and it was clearly intended as an attack on freedom of the press. But the AP did not respond to Wynn when it was submitted to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court uh, did not require the Associated Press to respond. Given how oligarchs are increasingly engaged in lawfare against the press, this is a win for the First Amendment. In another development, we have a city in Kansas is found to be liable for the newspaper raids, illegal newspaper raids that were carried out. This was a U.S. judge, U.S. District Court Judge Daniel D. Crabtree in Kansas ruled that the city of Marion and Marion County are liable for illegal raids against the Marion County Record newspaper on August 11th, 2023. As the Record reported, Crabtree declared defendant manufactured probable cause to procure search warrants, used those search warrants to raid the newspaper's place of operations, and plainly violated the terms of the search warrant to seize the newspaper's every computer, effectively shutting it down. And continued by saying any reasonable official in the defendant's shoes would know that this conduct is unlawful. The court easily concludes that plaintiffs have alleged a violation of the First Amendment's freedom of the press. Our next story is another good development that the Idaho governor signed a journalism shield bill into law. This is Idaho Governor Brad Little. Up until March 27th, Idaho was one of 10 states in the U.S. to not have a shield law that protected journalists. That changed now that Idaho Governor Brad Little signed a bill into law that would protect reporters from being forced to reveal their media sources. Scott McIntosh, a journalism professor in Idaho and the chair of the Idaho Press Club's First Amendment Committee, emphasized how the bill was viewed as a media source shield law. In other words, according to McIntosh, it was in lawmakers' interest to pass the bill, in addition to protecting reporters from having a judge compel them to disclose sources. It protected lawmakers when they anonymously speak to the press. The next story involves the CDC hiding a measles assessment for communities with low vaccination rates. ProPublica reported that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention produced an assessment that modeled the risk of measles in the United States. It found that the risk was high in communities with low vaccination rates that are, quote, near outbreaks or share close social ties to those areas with outbreaks, end quote. But as the number of cases of measles in the US jumped 28% over the last week, this was mostly in Texas, the CDC censored the assessment, refusing to post the forecast on the CDC's website. A whistleblower at the CDC told ProPublica that it was not normal at all and they had never seen anything like it while working at the CDC. This individual refused to be named for fear of reprisal as layoffs loom. Next story, a whistleblower exposes rampant corruption at a police department in Eunice, Louisiana. This is a police lieutenant, Michael Dunn. He filed a lawsuit in a U.S. court that alleges that the city of Eunice in Louisiana, the Eunice police chief, and Eunice police officers violated Louisiana's whistleblower statute, as well as his First Amendment rights as a whistleblower. Represented by the ACLU, the complaint reveals that he faced alleged retaliation for exposing police brutality, neglect of prisoners' medical needs, and the misuse of funds. After he tried to challenge this misconduct, Dunn claims that he was the target of a frame up effort where an individual facing criminal charges falsely alleged that he had bribed that person. And the Energy Department has instructed employees to conceal DOJA files from Freedom of Information Act requests, as covered by TechCrunch. The U.S. Department of Energy informed employees that any documents used by DOJA to assess agency grants and contracts must be marked as legal privilege. That way, it will be harder for the press and public to obtain the files via the Freedom of Information Act. So, this is just one method of abuse, secrecy abuse, that is unfolding when it comes to the Trump administration. We had a number of other things happening as well. A few tidbits before we get to the main story for this week's edition. I put together an article at the Dissenter on the Trump administration invoking the state secrets privilege in the Venezuela migrants case. These are the migrants that are accused falsely. Very, very thin evidence, scant evidence brought to Ecuador or shipped to Honduras because they are supposedly members of Tren de Aragua, this Venezuelan prison gang. They looked at these tattoos that several of these men had, and they're not signifiers of them being members of a gang, and yet that's how the Trump administration treated those tattoos. And a judge sought information about why the flights proceeded and the men were taken out of the United States, even though he had ordered a halt to their removal from the U.S. And the response of the Trump administration was to invoke state secrets privilege and essentially engage in the kind of fraud and deception that is routine when officials invoke the state secrets privilege. And so I saw on various websites explainers about the state secrets privilege. People who follow the Dissenter and or listen to me do this podcasting probably are familiar with the state secrets privilege. I regularly cover it and how it conceals criminal actions of the government, hides uh, the officials from being held accountable for wrongdoing, denies people their day in court when they want to challenge violations of their civil rights. And for the broader public who read the mass media, it's just not something that is regularly given attention. And so now you have these explainer articles that pretend or purport to give people a bit of an idea of the state secrets privilege, but it didn't really get into the origin of it. And it didn't reckon with the fact that the state secrets privilege came from a case in which the Air Force engaged in fraud so that they were not held liable for a staggering amount of money, did not have to pay a lot of damages to widows who lost their husbands who were civilian engineers in a military aircraft accident. So I'm not going to go further into that. You can go to the Dissenter and read the full story if you're not familiar with this background. But I dug into the first state secrets case and how it established the privilege and its similarity with what Trump is doing now, and looking at the history and this lineup of cases that have come over the last 70 years to show you that it isn't incredibly extraordinary what Trump is doing. This is how government officials often invoke the state secrets privilege. Now, so speaking of things in which the past week we had the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on censorship industrial complex is a kind of a word that has become appealing to the Republicans and the larger right wing media echo chamber in the United States. It has some validity. There's examples of it. They refer to NewsGuard and other entities that claim to be tracking disinformation and instead uh, are known to be engaged in information suppression. But that being said, they're disingenuous when it comes to the fact that there are other attacks on free speech and censorship, and they don't have a complete nonpartisan way of dealing with this issue. There's also the hearing on NPR and PBS that took place by the House Oversight Subcommittee, chaired by Marjorie Taylor Greene, always the kookiest of individuals, but there are others in the Congress who give her a run for their money these days. Both of these hearings were convened by Republicans and intended to promote the slashing of public investments in journalism and the news media and to further attacks on the press by disingenuously casting most in the news media establishment as opponents of the First Amendment. So I do have a clip queued up here of Gabe Rotman, the vice president of policy for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. He was speaking as a witness at the censorship hearing. This is one of the few moments that touched upon threats to freedom of expression intensifying under the Trump administration. That's a good lead in to our main story.
Not much subtlety in saying to the Associated Press, if you use the term Gulf of Mexico, you're not welcome in the White House. Is there?
It is explicit viewpoint discrimination that underpins retaliatory actions by the White House, and that makes it a First Amendment violation.
And deportation of individuals for making statements, political statements, where would you characterize that?
So the authority that's been invoked, so I come at it from the freedom of the press perspective. But what's notable about some of those cases is they're relying on a statute that explicitly allows immigration enforcement actions based on the speech of the person the actions being taken against, and that's of great concern for the press.
So you see there, Gabe Rotman was describing what happened to Rumeysa Ozturk, a PhD student at Tufts University in Somerville, Massachusetts, near Boston, and how it links to freedom of the press. Now, if you're not familiar with what happened this past week with Rumeysa Ozturk, that's the main story. She was kidnapped off the streets for co-authoring an op-ed in the Tufts Daily newspaper that criticized university administrators for not engaging with students intent on holding the Israeli government accountable for the war and human rights abuses against Palestinians that violate international law. It was a boycott, divestment, sanctions, kind of an endorsement. And I'll get to it when I conclude the main story. But the ACLU is now representing her while she is in detention, and they petitioned for her release and a halt to her deportation because she was snatched up by ICE agents. She's an international PhD student, according to the ACLU's petition, arrested on March 25th, 2025, when 6 plainclothes federal officers surrounded her on the street just outside her home in Somerville, Massachusetts. Rumeysa screamed as a man in a hooded sweatshirt grabbed her. And according to the filing in court, several other officers encircled her and soon covered their faces with masks. There's surveillance video I have playing on loop here. At one point, someone does call into question whether they in fact are officers because there's no clear markings that they are law enforcement. Rumeysa was handcuffed and escorted with an officer holding each arm into an unmarked vehicle. For more than 20 hours, her friends, family, and legal counsel could not locate or contact her. After an exhaustive search, they learned that she had ultimately been removed from Massachusetts, and again in defiance of a court order, and sent more than 1,300 miles away to an ICE detention facility in Louisiana. She had an asthma attack along the way. Of course, we can presume that the ICE agents who were transporting her had no care whatsoever that she was going through this medical emergency. The Canary Mission, which is this group that is funded by wealthy Jewish Americans and Jewish American groups. The Forward exposed in 2018 that the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, a major Jewish charity with an annual budget of over $100 million, is involved in funding. Other groups like that fund the Canary Mission, which is a McCarthyist kind of blacklisting website that has a database of students and professors that are involved in supporting Palestinian human rights. And there's been an increase in the number of people added to the database and the militancy of Canary Mission over the past year and a half, owed to the war on Gaza. There are clear issues of press freedom, and this group, Canary Mission, put together a page for Rumeysa Ozturk, and it's believed that that contributed to her visibility and possibly her deportation, though the Trump administration has openly asserted that they were not relying on any information compiled by Canary Mission. Ozturk is being punished for an article published by her school newspaper. Several groups led by the Student Press Law Center signed on to a letter that condemned the weaponization of her visa status against her. So she has a visa here in the US where she's been studying to complete her PhD. And in this letter, these groups, the groups that signed on to this, also include the Freedom of the Press Foundation, PEN America, the Society of Professional Journalists. And so this letter said, "We note that these efforts may start with students, but it likely will not end there. If the federal government can take these steps for an op-ed in a student newspaper, what will prevent it from doing so with journalists and others with whom it disagrees? The First Amendment is an asset, not an inconvenience. Citizens and non-citizens alike are entitled to free speech. Institutions that value free speech rights don't seek out opportunities to disregard them. Student visas may be the lowest hanging fruit for now, but those who revoke visas of op-ed writers are sure to seize upon any legal theory that might permit them to punish others with whom they disagree. For now, Judge Denise Casper in Massachusetts has blocked Ozturk's deportation. Efforts by the ACLU continue to return her to her home. Anyone who wrote or co-authored any article in their school newspaper over the past 1.5 years criticizing the Israeli government now must fear that the Trump administration will purge them along with other students from their campus. In solidarity with Rumeysa Ozturk and in defense of freedom of expression, which is so clearly under attack in this moment, I'll end this show by reading the op-ed that was co-authored nearly a year ago. There's three other students or three other individuals that wrote it with Rumeysa Ozturk. Though its content may have lost some of its relevance due to the passage of time, it still is a strong appeal by students to administrators to recognize the moral obligation that they have to stand up for human rights. And, since she's in jeopardy of basically not being permitted to complete her PhD because she engaged in freedom of expression, let's read this letter and then we'll wrap. It was published under the headline, "Try Again, President Kumar, Renewing Calls for Tufts to Adopt March 4 Tufts Community Union Senate Resolutions." So I'll just preface before I get to this that this is very in the weeds student politics on the Tufts University campus. On March 4th, the Tufts Community Union Senate passed 3 out of 4 resolutions demanding that the university acknowledge the Palestinian genocide, apologize for university president Sunil Kumar's statements, disclose its investments, and divest from companies with direct or indirect ties to Israel. These resolutions were the product of meaningful debate by the Senate and represent a sincere effort to hold Israel accountable for clear violations of international law. Credible accusations against Israel include accounts of deliberate starvation and indiscriminate slaughter of Palestinian civilians and plausible genocide. Unfortunately, the university's response to the Senate resolutions has been wholly inadequate and dismissive of the Senate, the collective voice of the student body. Graduate Students for Palestine joins Tufts Students for Justice in Palestine, the Tufts Faculty and Staff Coalition for Ceasefire, and Fletcher Students for Palestine to reject the university's response. Although graduate students were not allowed by the university into the Senate meeting, which lasted for almost 8 hours, are present on campus and financial entanglement with the university via tuition payments, and the graduate work that we do on grants and research makes us direct stakeholders in the university's stance. While an argument may be made that the university should not take political stances and should focus on research and intellectual exchange, the automatic rejection, dismissive nature, and condescending tone in the university's statement have caused us to question whether the university is indeed taking a stand against its own declared commitments to free speech, assembly, and democratic expression. According to the Student Code of Conduct, quote, active citizenship, including exercising free speech and engaging in protest, gathering, and demonstrations, is a vital part of the Tufts community, end quote. In addition, the Dean of Students' Office has written, quote, while at times the exchange of controversial ideas and opinions may cause discomfort or even distress, our mission as a university is to promote critical thinking, the rigorous examination and discussion of facts and theories, and diverse and sometimes contradictory ideas and opinions, end quote. Why then is the university discrediting and disregarding its students who practice the very ideals of critical thinking, intellectual exchange, and civic engagement that Tufts claims to represent? The role of the TCU Senate resolutions is abundantly clear. The Senate's resolutions serve as a strong lobbying tool that expresses to the Tufts administration the wants and needs of the student body, They speak as a collective voice and are instrumental in enacting systemic changes. And that, what I just read, is a quote. Continuing, in this case, the quote, systemic changes, end quote, that the collective voice of the student body is calling for are for the university to end its complicity with Israel insofar as it is oppressing the Palestinian people and denying their right to self-determination, a right that is guaranteed by international law. These strong lobbying tools are all the more urgent now, given the order by the International Court of Justice confirming that the Palestinian people of Gaza's rights under the Genocide Convention are under a plausible, to quote, plausible risk of being breached. This collective student voice is not without precedent. Today, the university may remember with pride its decision in February 1989 to divest from South Africa under apartheid and end its complicity with the then racist regime. However, we must remember that the university divested up to 11 years after some of its peers. For instance, the Michigan State University Board of Regents passed resolutions to end its complicity with apartheid South Africa as early as 1978. Had Tufts heeded the call of the student movement in the late 70s, the university could have been on the right side of history sooner. We reject any attempt by the university or the office of the president to summarily dismiss the role of the Senate and mischaracterize its resolution as divisive. The open and free debate demonstrated by the Senate process, exemplified by the length, open notice, and substantive exchange in the proceedings and the non-passing of one of the proposed resolutions, together with the serious organizing efforts of students, warrant credible self-reflection by the office of the president and the university. We, as graduate students, affirm the equal dignity and humanity of all people and reject the university's mischaracterization of the Senate's efforts. The great author and civil rights champion James Baldwin once wrote, quote, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which they are being educated," end quote. As an educator, President Kumar should embrace efforts by students to evaluate, quote, diverse and sometimes contradictory ideas and opinions, end quote. Furthermore, the president should trust in the Senate's rigorous and democratic process and the resolutions that it has achieved. We urge President Kumar and the Tufts administration to meaningfully engage with and actualize the resolutions passed by the Senate. And their names at the bottom, but given the chilly climate, I won't read the other students. You can go find them. And you can see Rumeysa Ozturk, one of the authors of this op-ed. This is the op-ed that led ICE agents to come and kidnap and effectively rendition her to a state within the United States, Louisiana, that will put up with this, that will allow people who are visa holders, people who have green cards, people who are immigrants who engage in political speech, will allow their prisons or jails to be used in a manner that so clearly goes against everything that we're supposed to celebrate as a people: openness, freedom of speech, and the ability to print and write what we would like in the press, so long as it's not inciting violence against other people or um, directly harming somebody. And so here we are. This is something we have to be on guard for. The Dissenter Weekly will keep tabs on where this goes next. We all know, if you are paying attention, that Rumeysa Ozturk is not the only student to be picked up for engaging in speech. Mahmoud Khalil became the model case, became the what we see as the first of many attacks on students who have been engaged in pro-Palestinian activism on their university or college campuses. And then there are now others that we're learning about who are being abducted by masked men, broad daylight, unaccountable, believing that there's nothing that can stop anyone in the administration who wants to do this to young people who are raising their voice. And so this attack on dissent, this clampdown, becomes part of the climate that feeds into an already worsening climate for freedom of the press and an already worsening climate for anyone who wants to raise their voice in government and speak out against corruption and injustices that are being perpetrated by the Trump administration. So thank you for tuning in to this week's show. Again, if you have any interest in this newsletter and you're not a subscriber, please take a moment to go and subscribe. So you can go to that's the portal link that you can put into your computer. You can also go to the dissenter.org/donate and just give a few dollars if you are not able to regularly contribute. Thank you. I'll be back next week with another show.